Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started with the research conference. For those of you who would like to get CME credit, here's the code here. So when we go to the first slide, and on behalf of my co-presenters, Dr. Ahmed Vora, one of our fellows at the DCRI, and Dr. Michael Pencina, Director of Statistics, we're pleased to present this research conference to you. And the title here is Data Monitoring Committees for Clinical Trials, Addressing Emerging Challenges and Promoting Best Practices. And we're going to highlight for you a think tank meeting that we ran in June of this year in Washington, D.C. on this topic, and share with you, some history around our long track record in running think tank meetings, why we do those, and what came out of this meeting. And it's really a unique thing at the DCRI to be involved with these meetings that are highly interactive, highly anticipated by all the different meeting attendees, and will typically result in publication of a white paper, which is what we're working on right now from this very meeting. And so at the meeting in June, Carrie Lee, Michael Pencina, myself, and Ahmed Vora represented the DCRI, and it was really a fun meeting. And Carrie will invite you to share some comments from the meeting when we have the discussion section at the end.
Morel also represented the DC.
Yeah, we have a slide on that in just a minute here. So you beat me to the punch. So this is what we'll talk about today, and I'll just go through the first few slides. So starting in 1995, when Dr. Califf was the director of the DCRI, we started holding think tank meetings as a way to provide a forum where leaders in academics, government, regulatory bodies like the FDA, and industry could interact in a kind of a neutral environment that was acceptable to all parties and discuss important issues of major concern to the clinical research community. And some recent topics that have been developed before we did our think tank in June of this year are shown here. There was a think tank on medication adherence, which is a very big issue, not only in clinical practice, but certainly in randomized clinical trials as we try to test a new therapy. Cardiovascular drug development last summer, I had the opportunity to help Dr. Califf in running that meeting. It was very successful. We published a paper earlier this year in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, written by Chris Fordyce, one of our fellows here. And then in 2013, a think tank on resistant hypertension. Many different meetings held in the past, most resulting, like I said, in publication of a white paper. And without Morel Maubert here, we would not have think tanks, and she's really the key person to organize, get the funding arranged, help to implement very successful meetings, and I just think she deserves a special word of thanks for all the things that she's done in the meetings. So, thank you, Morel. So I'm going to hand it over to Ahmed, who will present some slides about our meeting. I will give a brief introduction for Ahmed, who is a fourth-year Duke Cardiology Fellow, a second-year DCRI Fellow. He somehow did training in those northern cities of Baltimore and Boston, but he got the light. He decided to come down to Duke for his fellowship, and he's been highly productive and successful. And I've had the opportunity to work closely with him, as well as Dr. Tracy Wong and other cardiologists here. And I think it was a great opportunity for him to attend the think tank, kind of help follow what was going on, and then help us drafting the white paper, which is currently in draft form right now. So I will hand it over to Ahmed, and then Michael Pencina will make some comments afterwards, and then we'll look forward to a robust discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. So I just wanted to start by giving you all a little bit of background. Can you all hear me okay? Give you a little bit of background into what went into this particular think tank meeting and the important issues that were discussed. And then, as Matt said, Michael will provide some comments at the end. This is really meant to be an open discussion, and so if there are any questions or comments that arise during the slides, please feel free to interrupt. And so, for this particular think tank, there was so specifically with respect to data monitoring committees, there was a mini think tank that was organized a couple of years ago in 2013, and that was held right here. That also brought together members from academia, industry, and government to talk a little bit about the emerging issues for the future of data monitoring committees. At that time, the main issues that were focused on were really challenges to effective data monitoring committee functioning. And at that time, they really spoke, I think most specifically, about the roles and responsibilities of the modern DMC, and then challenges with respect to lack of training and the lack of really general kind of best practices and operating principles. And so a more comprehensive think tank was planned for June of this year that was, that occurred at a hotel outside of Washington, D.C., to allow for even more representatives from academia, from industry, and from government. In the intervening time, as you all know, Dr. Califf moved to the FDA, and so this meeting was led by Matt Rowe, as well as David Demetz of Wisconsin and Tom Fleming from the University of Washington, both of whom really are considered sort of the godfathers of the modern data monitoring committee. And so the key meeting participants, representatives from academia included Matt, Dave, Tom, Michael, Carrie from here, Ken Mahaffey from Stanford, Susan Ellenberg from Penn, who also, along with David and Thomas, are leaders in this particular field, and then a few others: Mark Pfeffer, Charles Hennigan, other folks that have had extensive experience with DMCs. There were a fair number of representatives from government as well, and so Bob Temple from actually from the FDA, David Gordon, Bram Zuckerman, Kareem Callis, Patrick Archdeacon. There are a lot of folks from FDA, NHLBI, NIH, and then CEDAR and CDRH. And then also many of our industry colleagues that many of you have worked with in the past, including Jack Lawrence from BMS, Thomas Anderson from AstraZeneca, Ray Bain from Merck, et cetera. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background into the modern data monitoring committee. And so, as you all know, the history of the modern randomized clinical trial is really only about 70 or so years old. About 50 years ago, in order to address some of the complex issues associated with multi-institutional clinical trials, the National Heart Institute had formed a special committee that was led by Dr. Bernard Greenberg, who is a statistician at the University of North Carolina, to lead a special committee to sort of examine some of these challenges. One of the main recommendations that came out of this meeting, and again, so the meeting occurred in 1967, it really wasn't even formally published until 20 years later. But the main recommendation really was for the need for an external monitoring board to review the study protocol, monitor trial conduct, and stop a trial if appropriate. As you all know, there have been significant changes in data safety monitoring boards over the last 30 years, and this slide is courtesy of David Gordon from the NHLBI. For one, there have been sophisticated sequential monitoring methods that have been developed, including stopping rules to stop a trial either in favor of significant efficacy, significant harm, or futility. There's been an increased sensitivity to conflicts of interest, both real and perceived, and both financial and intellectual. There has been an increasing prominence of the Food and Drug Administration with respect to the regulatory regime under which both drugs and devices operate. And then there has been increased diversity, both in terms of clinical trial participants as well as the folks that design and run these large trials. And so the FDA issued guidance most recently in 2006 with respect to the nature and scope of the modern DMC. And this slide is courtesy of Carrie Lee. So the FDA had said that a fundamental reason to establish a DMC is to enhance the safety of a trial of trial participants in situations where safety concerns may be unusually high. DMCs are generally recommended for a controlled trial of any size where rates of mortality or major morbidity are compared. And they're generally not needed for trials at early stages of product development. They're also not required, nor are they recommended for most clinical studies. The FDA specifically also stated that a DMC is recommended when either a highly favorable or unfavorable result or futility at an interim analysis might ethically require early termination, if there are a priori reasons for a particular safety concern, if there is the possibility of serious toxicity, if the trial studies patients that are especially vulnerable, including children, pregnant women, very elderly patients, etc., if the study population is at increased risk, or if the study is large, multi-center, or goes on for a very long period of time. So then one may ask, why not have a data monitoring committee for every trial? And as you can imagine, having a DMC adds administrative complexity. It requires significant additional resources. And I think most importantly, it draws on a pool of individuals with the requisite knowledge, wisdom, and experience that is unfortunately inherently limited. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about in the future. And so perhaps turning the question on its head, the problem is not necessarily that there are too many DMCs, but rather that there are just too few people with the requisite experience, wisdom, and judgment to constitute DMCs when in fact they actually are needed. There have been a number of studies that have looked at how DMCs are used in current clinical practice or in current clinical trials. This paper was published by Rob Califf and colleagues in 2012. And what they did was they looked at the clinicaltrials.gov database for which all trials have to be registered. They looked from 2007 to 2010, there were about 41,000 trials that were registered during that time. They focused specifically on trials within the domains of cardiovascular disease, psychiatry, and oncology. And they found that there was significant heterogeneity in how data monitoring committees were actually used. And so among these three domains, a little bit less than half of all trials used a data monitoring committee. Significant predictors of DMC use included if the sponsor was the NIH, which led to those trials were 9 times more likely to have a DMC. And then cardiovascular trials and oncology trials also were more likely to have used DMCs. But as you can imagine, there was significant heterogeneity, and a lot of the heterogeneity had to do with exactly what people feel the role and the scope of DMC should be. And so this slide is courtesy of Patrick Archdeacon, who was one of the members of CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which also is housed here and led by many of the folks here in the audience. And this slide really shows a survey that was done among participants in clinical trial operations as to what they view the most important activity that a DMC should perform. And among all organizers, the main activity that was felt to be the most important for a DMC was to review both summary adverse events and primary outcomes by treatment arm and to assess benefits to risks. Just behind that was to review accumulating safety or summary adverse events and by treatment arm and then overall. Importantly, most participants did not feel that reviewing individual adverse event reports was or should be a function of a DMC. And this was consistent generally across not only all organizers, but then specific groups, including the academics in the audience, AROs, CROs, government sponsors, and industry. And so one of the key points that came from this think tank, especially with respect to the nature and the scope of data monitoring committees, is that all trials need careful monitoring, but not all trials necessarily need an independent DMC. And independent DMCs are really most needed for either randomized trials that are intended to provide a definitive data regarding treatments intended to save lives or prevent serious disease, or when interim analyses of safety and efficacy are considered essential to ensure the safety of trial participants. I wanted to take a quick step back and, especially for those of you that don't have significant experience in clinical trial operations, to really give you a sense of where the DMC sits in the kind of the overall clinical trial framework. And so the DMC really does sit in the center of many of the communication pathways. You can see the sponsor. So the sponsor sort of on the side over here and interfaces directly with the steering and the executive committee, which interfaces with the regulatory agencies. The independent data monitoring committee, though, has to interface not only with the sponsor and the SC and the EC, but then also with the independent data center as well as the statistical data analytics center, which then interfaces with investigators, IRBs, and patients. And so it really sits at the center of the modern clinical trial and is responsible for monitoring patient safety and ensuring trial integrity. I now want to spend a little bit of time talking about, or at least recounting the discussion, especially with respect to issues facing the modern DMC. And some of the main issues that were highlighted during this think tank were the lack of adequate training for DMC members, lack of academic recognition, and the importance of maintaining independence, especially maintaining confidentiality as well as managing conflicts of interest. And so, with respect to training for DMC members, are DMC members adequately trained? So in that same survey that I mentioned to you before of DMC, of all members, only 8% of respondents reported ever actually being formally trained to serve on a DMC. Now, of that 8%, about 2/3 were trained before joining their first DMC, whereas 1/3 were trained after joining their first. And of the ones that were trained after, they unanimously would have preferred being trained before. Now, I understand that, clearly one of the limitations of the survey is a small sample size, but I think that it does really highlight the fact that most people that serve on a DMC are not really trained at all, and there is perhaps sort of a yearning or at least a need for more comprehensive training options. Part of the reasons why there may be insufficient training for DMC members may be that sponsors just don't really request or necessarily require it. And so as you can see here, really on the left side of the screen, only a small proportion of sponsors required formal training for their DMC members. And an even smaller proportion of sponsors actually offer training for members serving on their DMC. And so one of the main things that was discussed during the think tank meeting was coming up with a number of different training modalities to adequately train the next generation of potential DMC members. And so the different components would include, for one, a formal didactics, which may include clinical coursework in clinical trials operations, data monitoring, ethics, and data surveillance methodologies. This is something that either can be done independently or can be incorporated into master's level training programs like the CRTP that we have here for all of our fellows and for all of our trainees. Additionally, this would be complemented by web-based modules that potentially can be implemented using an online open coursework framework, similar to what many other large institutions are using across fields. It would also include case-based training examples, and ideally would lead to sort of an online certification process following satisfactory completion, sort of a stamp of approval from a major institution or a major university, signifying satisfactory completion. However, both formal didactics and web-based modules likely would not be enough and would really need to be supplemented by real-world experience. And real-world experience can happen across a number of possibilities. One that I'll talk about briefly is the standard internal DMC model, which is used by the folks over at Merck. Another would be an apprentice model in which a senior DMC member would bring a junior colleague to all of their DMC meetings. The junior colleague would not necessarily have voting powers or anything like that, but similar to the way that many of you all incorporate fellows as important members of the trials that we're part of. A similar sort of model can be used in DMCs. And then a third would be to have non-voting participants that are there participating in all of DMC meetings and activities to really get a sense of what it's like and what these discussions are like. And so one example that I wanted to highlight that was emphasized at the meeting was the standing internal DMC at Merck Research Labs. And so, as I mentioned before, all trials do not need DMCs, and many trials that are done internally at many of our by many of our industry sponsors do not oftentimes require external monitoring. And so what some places have done is to incorporate a DMC type model internally, allowing for many of their employees to develop at least some type of experience, with respect to the methodologies, et cetera, in terms of data safety and monitoring. Another shortcoming that was highlighted at the meeting was the lack of academic recognition for DMC activities. As many of you know, DMC contracts are typically constructed as private consulting agreements instead of independent scientist arrangements. There's also very limited academic recognition of these activities. There's very limited potential for publication. Members of the DMC often are not included on the primary manuscript or subsequent manuscripts. They occasionally have a chance to publish lessons learned from DMC service, but this is done kind of very after the fact and in a very limited capacity. It's also not considered as institutional service, similar to or very different from an institutional review board, for example, which also performs many similar functions, such as making sure that participant safety is ensured, ensuring that the trial is done in with a significant amount of integrity, et cetera. But it's not considered sort of in the same vein. And then also, mentorship is not really recognized formally either. And so we felt that this lack of overall academic recognition may limit participation of well-qualified individuals. And so possibilities or other ways in which we potentially can increase academic recognition of DMC service would include, for one, increasing institutional recognition of service. This may involve designing contracts more as independent scientist agreements as opposed to private consulting arrangements. Allowing for salary support or institutional support, research support as compensation for DMC activities. Encouraging academic contribution recognition to be similar to service on an IRB. And to factor DMC service into academic appointment and promotion / tenure decisions. It also would be important to increase the opportunity for peer-reviewed publication. And so, in one way in which this could potentially happen is if there were an expectation for routine publication of DMC proceedings and discussion, really focusing on important methodologic and ethical issues pertaining to a specific trial. Right now this is done on a haphazard basis, but routine publication may be helpful. And then finally, just increasing the opportunity for mentorship. I think that mentorship is a primary reason why many folks choose to go into academia, and really creating an infrastructure where mentorship of junior colleagues is not only recognized, but is expected as part of serving on trial DMCs may also be helpful. Next, wanted to shift gears a little bit and chat about maintaining independence from sponsors. And so one specific thing that came up and has come up repeatedly is this issue of indemnification. And one concern that a lot of members or a lot of participants from DMCs have is that they oftentimes may be exposed to various sources of liability. Now, this may potentially include direct liability, although the likelihood for that is very low. Oftentimes, what people tend to be most concerned about are sort of indirect liability, which may include legal costs, if even you're deposed for some other large lawsuit, lost time from work, anxiety, stress, etc. And there was clear recognition that the current indemnification process is inadequate. For one, often these arrangements are negotiated confidentiality and really as kind of two-way arrangements between individual members and the sponsor. Academic institutions may not cover DMC members with respect to legal liability. And these contracts that are independently negotiated between members and the sponsor are oftentimes very variable and may not allow the member to obtain even independent counsel in the in the low likelihood that something were to happen and there were to be a legal claim. This is particularly complicated in NIH trials or other government-sponsored trials because, according to various readings of a law known as the Anti-Deficiency Act, the government is not allowed to provide a priori indemnification for non-government employees, and so this was something that had come up. Repeatedly as well. Managing conflicts of interest also was one of the main focuses of discussion at the think tank. As you all know, conflicts can be direct and indirect. They can be financial or intellectual. And one of the main things to come out of the think tank was that one of the keys to maintaining or to managing conflicts of interest is really ensuring transparency. And so, I'm sort of harping on a point that I've mentioned a number of times before, but really DMC members should be considered independent scientists and not just consultants or advisors to the sponsor. And it may be a small or a subtle point, but in terms of not only managing conflicts of interest, but really maintaining transparency and maintaining independence, most importantly, it's an important point. The topic of conversation for DMC members came up, and generally speaking, it was felt that compensation is reasonable, but perhaps should not be direct payment from the sponsor to the DMC member, and various other options were explored, including either via academic coordinating center or as institutional salary support or as research support. Really just to sort of disentangle the sort of direct kind of quid pro quo potential, or at least perception of a quid pro quo nature of the compensation. And then maintaining confidentiality. And as you all know, ensuring confidentiality of interim data is critical. There have been recent confidentiality breaches that have been catastrophic for the trials, and they can be incredibly damaging to trial integrity by affecting not only the enrollment for the overall trial, but as well as adherence to randomized therapies. And one thing that was sort of interesting that came up during the think tank was that the extent of insulation from the sponsor tends to be variable across the nature of trials, and in many ways is very dependent on the specific sponsor. And so, especially with respect to industry, the standard is that there's a complete firewall between the DMC and the sponsor. It turns out that it's not really like this in some of the NIH-sponsored trials. And so, broadly speaking, for NIH-sponsored trials, there tends to be a fair amount of separation between the DMC and the sponsor. But especially the NHLBI is a little bit different. They have a slightly different model. They have an executive secretary and a statistician that are obviously part of the NHLBI and part of the sponsoring team that sit in on all of the DMC sessions. And so there is a little bit of, there is a little bit of crosstalk. There is not kind of a complete firewall separation. Now I wanted to shift gears and just talk very briefly about some of the discussions that came out, especially with respect to best practices for DMCs. One particular point that had come up a number of times was what to include versus not include in the DMC charter. And this was a concern primarily because of the perception that charters now had become incredibly long, had focused really on specific legalistic language, as opposed to kind of defining the role of the DMC in broad scopes and creating a set of guidelines and binding principles as opposed to specific dictates. And so the charter should specify the individual roles and responsibilities of the members and highlight the role of the DMC chair, who is primarily responsible for not just taking votes, but really building a general consensus for all DMC decisions. It should identify a set of binding principles for members, provide some guidance regarding interim analyses, meeting frequency and safety boundaries, and then also identify a framework for adaptive designs. And this also is something that's come up really in the last 5 or 10 years, this nature of adaptive redesign for trials. And the members of the think tank were very clear that it should not be the role of the DMC to adaptively redesign these trials, that they may be able to provide input as to whether or not a particular redesign is appropriate or should be implemented, but really the design of the overall trial should be part of the steering and executive committees and not the DMC. I wanted to highlight very quickly the role of the Statistical Data Analytics Center. And so for any DMC, for any well-functioning DMC, an SDAC is a critical team member to ensure that they receive all of the data in a very timely and a very complete manner in order to make appropriate decisions. And so the main responsibilities for an SDAC include clearly maintaining independence from the sponsor, maintaining confidentiality of the study results, maintaining flexibility in contracting. One of the things that had come up was that some SDACs contract, or some sponsors contract with SDACs on sort of a per page, or like a per hour basis. It was very clear that there needed to be some flexibility in this contracting. And then also to resist pressure to perform what would very clearly be biased analyses. There was also some talk about what the actual report that the SDAC submits to the DMC should include. And so for one, it should be focused on providing complete but necessary information. It should be succinct, yet also include everything. And it should be clearly and very logically structured, including an executive summary, a protocol synopsis, summary notes from previous meetings, The degree of homework that a lot of the DMC members do tends to be very variable. Include all of the interim study results in a non-blinded manner, and then also provide some background and some sort of depth with respect to how good the data are. And so I wanted to leave a fair amount of time for discussion. And so, so to conclude, as I mentioned, the role of the DMC really has changed over the last couple of decades, but the main responsibilities for the modern Independent Data Monitoring Committee are, number one, to maintain patient safety, and number two, to preserve trial credibility. Some of the threats to effective functioning of DMCs include a lack of adequate training for DMC members, lack of academic recognition for DMC activities, and maintaining independence. So maintaining independence and ensuring confidentiality. Some of the DMC best practices include having an effective, well thought out charter that clearly lays out roles and responsibilities and identifies a set of binding principles for the DMC, and also having an effective statistical analytic data center to provide the DMC with complete information. Thanks very much. And then, Matt, do you want to mention the future ones, or we do it at the end?
Okay, thank you, Amit. This is a great presentation, a great set of slides. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start over and give the presentation again, so you really remember everything. No, what I will do is I'd like to highlight a few points from the presentation, and with the focus on bringing it home. So I think Amit gave a great overview of DMCs, the big picture, where the world is and what the world needs. And we are actively involved in DMC support and academic collaboration. So we have a initiative product led by Bob Bigelow, and with involvement of people in statistics, our clinical leaders, both Matt and John, are involved in it, and we're working on having a DMC ready to face the challenges of the modern world. So I will go through some of these slides quickly and kind of mention things how they tie to what we are doing here at the DCRI. I'll start with an anecdote. So when I was offered the job to work at DCRI, my first actual event that I attended, even before I was employed, was the mini think tank that happened in this room. And first thought I had was, oh, DCRI has really poor facilities. My second thought was, wow, DCRI has to be an amazing institution. It can get really high-level thought leaders to sit in this room for 2 days without complaining. So there must be something going on. And then I attended the think tank that Marel organized, and it's one of the nicest hotels the country has. So completely different experience. Same great thought leaders, but the environment was shockingly different, so much so I want to bribe Marel to invite me to more of these think tanks, so just spend a few more nights in the hotel. So where I want to jump right now is one comment on the survey I feel obliged to give you as a statistician. This is a biased sample. Okay, and this is important. These are experts. These are people. I was on the part of the city initiative. We recommended people to whom this is sent. These are the thought leaders. So it's not bias doesn't always mean useless. And in this case, this is people who know what they are talking about, giving these impressions and opinions. That probably does not reflect a vast majority, or maybe not vast, but a majority, unfortunately, of DMCs in the real world. So now on the issues facing the modern DMC, and that ties nicely to what we're trying to address at DCRI. So the lack of adequate training for members, I think, is very important. There are many more DMCs than trained members. The good members are recycled over and over again, and they can't keep track. I think some of the people attending the meetings or responding to the survey said that they're on like 14, 16 DMCs. And if you add your regular job, unless serving on DMCs is your job, which was a little bit strange, if you add your regular job, you can't pay attention to everything that's going on. So we desperately need to train DMC members. Amit gave a great overview of how this can be done. And we've started talking to Tracy, DCRI Education, about putting together a training program, because we as DCRI are very uniquely positioned to be leaders in something like that. And it serves a number of purposes. It's our squarely within our academic mission. It's also a great way to advertise our services, right? If we're the teachers and educators of the future members, we are the natural people with whom they might want to partner. So I'm very excited about the potential. It needs more work, but there is a great educational opportunity. And again, any of our faculty and staff with experience having interest in it, definitely let me know if you want to be a part of the program we'll be putting together. The lack of academic recognition is an interesting one, and it's very real at Duke. When I came here, again, I was on, I think maybe 4 or 5 DMCs, and I wanted to bring it as part of my DCRI support, right? Bring it as part of my effort. I was told that the Duke IRB does not recognize my independent DMC service as a satisfying academic mission. So they said, no, we're not interested, keep it privately. And keeping it privately becomes challenging because of the identification issue. So it is still a topic that needs to be resolved. But the academic recognition is a big issue. The other side of it is how does Duke Legal see our involvement in it? And I've been in some fascinating discussions with our lawyers on the university level, so even beyond DCRI, but going to the university, and they had a reasonable approach. It's not that they worry about the right things, which is Duke as a nonprofit, and they really worry about us not being a service organization, but everything that we do satisfying the academic mission, which I fully embrace. But what I was able to do is to persuade them that DMCs are very, very much within the academic mission, and that happens on multiple levels. First and foremost is the service to humanity, to the patients in the trials, overseeing the safety. That needs expertise, but academicians with the objectivity and the experience are very qualified to provide it, and that needs to be better understood. The second one is the access to data, which again, in many of our contracts, it's a very important part of being able to have the right to publish after the analysis. But for DMCs, we wouldn't take a DMC data during the trial and publish a paper when the trial is going on, right? That's not the purpose. The purpose is to integrate it with other DMC data and look at things like as information accumulates over time, when would we have known to stop the trial or the trial is safe, and so on. So very interesting research, the risk and benefit considerations that can be performed on this data after the trial is finished. So when I tell the sponsors, we're not going to touch your data, we'll aggregate it, will be anonymized, they don't worry, our Duke Legal is happy, and things are good. And the third is the educational opportunity, the apprenticeship model that Amit was talking about, right? Involving our fellows, involving our staff or faculty in learning how to conduct the SMBs. So this is an education, right? We don't have to charge for that, but we can train people on the go as part of it. Well, now that's academic mission, that's education, that's what universities should be doing. So it fits very well, it just needs to have the appropriate focus. The other point I want to make is relating to the Merck program. they're internal DMC-like. And some of you have heard me talking about the two sides of the medal in terms of monitoring. The outside monitoring performed at the data monitoring committees, and the internal monitoring. People talk about it as risk-based monitoring, but it's risk-based monitoring is only a component of it. But it's the trial internal monitoring, the quality surveillance going into our guiding principles and the ways we look at trials during the conduct, right? It's all monitoring. There is DMC have a function because they're objective and independent at arm's length, but also we are running the trial, and the CRI has been a pioneer of it on the trials we run, is worrying about the trial as it's going on. That doesn't mean unblinding, it doesn't mean breaking any rules, but making sure we have the right population, the event rates. We have some great examples on trials where the event rate was too low and we have to do interim re-estimation. And we can learn a lot. So keep in mind that DMC is one side of the coin, and again, the internal monitoring that we need to perform is the other kind. And for some trials, the internal monitoring can do a lot and DMC can do less. There is a lot of confusion in the role of DMC. DMC should not be performing the internal monitoring, and the internal monitors should not be perform DMC functions. Okay, I think I'll stop here, and maybe I'll ask Carrie to offer a few words related to the think tank and your overall comments.
Well, thank you. Great presentation. It was a wonderful meeting. And just
There we go. Sorry, go ahead.
just a great privilege to be able to participate in that. I think this is a very important topic. I've had the good fortune over a period of many years now to participate in many data monitoring committees. And first of all, I would say it's a very stimulating and enjoyable and sometimes challenging, but really a very rewarding experience. And I say that because I want to encourage the younger members of the faculty to consider involving themselves in data monitoring activity, learning all that you can about the operational procedures and the ways in which data are appropriately monitored and to participate. I really like the idea of an apprenticeship, and I would hope that at the DCRI we could really move that sort of a model forward and have many of our younger people participating in data monitoring committees where some of the more seasoned and experienced members of the faculty are involved. So I think there's a great need, as you've said, for more experienced people. There's no substitute on these committees for seasoned, wise, and experienced people, because oftentimes there are some very thorny decisions that have to be made with regard to the ongoing conduct of a major clinical trial. And there's a lot at stake, both for the patients as well as the sponsor, as well as the ongoing development of a line of therapy. And I've actually been involved in situations where an important line of development could have been prematurely shut off as a result of an unwise decision by a data monitoring committee. So there are a lot of qualities that I think are important ingredients for those that are members of these committees, and we need to help our younger people to develop some of those qualities and have those experiences so that the needs that exist to fill all of these data monitoring committees can be met. There's one other thing I'd like to say and follow up to Michael's comments, and that is, and Amos, the importance of the group that's preparing the report for the committee. And again, I've had the experience of seeing great variability in the quality of those reports. And I'm proud to say that the reports in general that have been produced by the DCRI have been first rate in general. And we can be proud of the work that's been done here in that regard. But the quality of the report can really make a difference in how well the monitoring committee can fulfill their responsibilities. Those are just a few.
Thank you, Carrie. I think at the meeting, someone mentioned that they had received a report that was more than 2,000 pages long. So if we could grab the microphone and pass that over to John. I think he has some comments. So thank you very much, Carrie. Your participation in the meeting was really a great factor in the success.
So a comment and a question. So I've also been involved in a number of DSMBs with apprentices, both as an apprentice and then with other young people working with me. And it's a great model where people get exposed to all of the internal discussion and get to really see the workings of a DSMB in the real world as opposed to the other world, the didactic world. The other advantage of working in a place like DCRI, I've been involved with a number of DSMBs where particularly challenging, thorny issues have come up where if you have your confidentiality agreement and are contracted through DCRI, you have the ability to reach out to people with more experience like Carrie or Dr. Rob Califf or Bob Harrington to have discussions about issues that you're challenged with on DSMBs. So then my question is about independence. And Amit, you talked about independence from the sponsor. But the other thing we've heard a lot and experienced a lot is independence from the academic leadership of the trial. Mm-hmm. And we've gotten pushback on being the DSMB coordinating center for trials when we are also running the operations or providing the academic leadership of the trial. So maybe you guys could comment a little bit on what the perspectives are in the world about that.
Yeah, I think that was more of a common model in the past where, say, we would coordinate a trial and have academic thought leadership and also do the DSMB, support and coordination. And that's less common these days, even though I think we have very well-established firewalls and, a track record where we can do both successfully. But there's a lot of scrutiny on the DSMB being completely independent, both physically and intellectually and, from other aspects as well. And so I think it's a point where we have to be able to articulate how we would run that and set that up. And also the advantage potentially of doing both in the same center for a number of reasons, as Michael brought up. But Michael, what are your thoughts on this?
I think you can see where the worry is, especially when DMCs and trials are run by the same for-profit organization, right? There is a clear incentive to let the trial continue because your profit as a clinical or contract research organization will be larger if the trial is not stopped. Now, for an academic institution, non-profit like ours, I think it's a little bit different, right? We would want to think we would not have that motivation because the patient and the truth is on top of our value. We're not responsible to shareholders or profit is not a bad thing, but it's very secondary in our proceedings. So I would propose that we could deserve an exception and be allowed with appropriate firewalls to provide full service. And our firewalls are phenomenal. I've witnessed it. We have statisticians who could be made examples of they're making the trial leadership mad at some points with their zeal for firewalls and protection of confidentiality. So I'm very confident that here we take it very seriously.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for a great discussion. I'm going to push back a little bit though, Carrie, and I don't know, maybe, well, let me just suggest that I think the DCRI can do a better job in consistently providing the highest level of reports. And without naming any names, I've actually heard from outside people that they're a little worried sometimes the reports are not as good, for example, as the highly organized and highly consistent kind of brand reports from Janet Wittes's group or from the Wisconsin group. And I think we have the opportunity to kind of have a Duke brand on supporting DSMBs that's the highest level and consistent, so that when DSMB members, when Duke is preparing the DSMB materials, that members know they're going to get something that's predictable, consistent, high quality. And that's not always the case. So I think we should demand that from ourselves. And I think that's a process that Bob and others are still going through to make sure we have. And it takes a big investment, and it takes leadership saying this is something that where there's going to be a little bit more kind of consistent oversight of how we do that.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the constructive words. I think the worst thing that we can experience and keep here patting ourselves on the backs and say, what a great job we're doing and life is great. So this is good. I think I would very much welcome you to have a conversation with Bob and go into particular examples, because we want to learn from those. I think the initiative we have going on, though, is producing fruit. And I'll give an example of the Themis trial, which has been, we're doing the DSMB, has been in contracting for a year. That's the worst contracting nightmare for whatever reasons on whatever side. And we've basically came in with our stats team very, very late, had to basically take it, turn it around, deliver it to the DMC and the sponsor. We've done a phenomenal job. We've been praised at the highest level of the organization. So I'm hopeful that things are moving in the right direction, but that's not to diminish your criticism. And I think it would be particularly constructive if you can point to the examples and the issues that were raised.
And I think that speaks for anything that we're involved with, is we always want to stay at the leading edge. We always want to be critical of what we're doing and improve and work on that. We should feel comfortable that we have an environment where we can challenge each other to maintain the best product and the best delivery that we can. So I think that's great. But the example that Michael just mentioned, I got independent, completely, unprecipitated. The sponsor just emailed me and said we really, really enjoyed the Themis DSMB support when we're working with the sponsor in a number of different unrelated activities. So that was definitely nice to hear.
Yeah, I don't think.
My
comment was not that we don't have excellence
Yeah.
and the best quality. It's a consistency.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, Chris. We're not. No, I think it's good that you brought that up, and we appreciate that. I remember that in many future research conferences where I have presented, Dr. Caleb has sat in the front row, and his hand will come up as soon as I'm finished. He'll say, "I have 4 questions," and then he'll give me 4 questions, and I can only remember the 4th one that he asked because there's so many. So I won't do that to the audience, but I will say that the think tank concept and process at DCRI lives on, and as we show here, there are 2 think tanks already planned in 2016. One on electronic health records and how those can be used to support clinical trials, like we're doing with the Adaptable trial, led by Eric Peterson, Adrian Hernandez, and Leslie Curtis. And then another one led by Chris Granger and our colleague Bernard Gersh from Mayo Clinic on anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation. Those 2 are on the books. There's a lot of interest. People are registering for those. In addition to that, we're actually doing a strategic initiative to try to develop a series of topics for the next 3 years that we're proactive in trying to do a think tank about every quarter. So I'm working with Morel and Eric in developing topics. They're being reviewed now by the FDA, the NIH, and industry partners and other academic collaborators, and we're hopeful to launch a whole kind of sustained series of these again in 2016. And so what we hope to do is, after we have each of these think tanks, have a research conference here at the DCRI a few months later on each of the think tanks that we run, so we can share the information with you well before we publish the white paper and understand what that means for the work that we're all doing together, because I think it's phenomenal to be able to attend one of these, but we want to make sure that that knowledge and that interaction lives on well beyond the meeting like we've done today. So thanks everyone for your attendance and for the remote audience for attending. We hope this has been an instructive research conference, and thank you again everyone for putting on the research conference.